If your wife is tired of the kids putting away the dishes like some kind of ninja throwing Chinese stars, then I have the solution for you that will make her happy. And you know what that means. I came up with this idea to build some custom drawers. And because I know my kids, I also use some self-closing, no-slam drawer slides. But some mistakes were definitely made, and I'm going to show you how to avoid them. Let's get started. First, I needed to figure out what size of drawers I needed. So I measured the depth of the cabinet, width, and height of the openings. Then got some 21-inch Undermount drawer slides, link in the description. Next, I made a material cut list so I didn't end up with 3 drawers instead of 4. Calculations are pretty easy. Because I'm using the Undermount drawer slides, the length of the slide is also the length of the drawer. And since I'm using 21-inch slides, I'll make the drawers 21 inches deep. Now, there are 2 ways of figuring out the width of the drawer. One is to follow the instructions, which involves way too much math. And who wants to do math when there are things to be built in the shop? The second is to put the slide into the cabinet and measure between the slides. This is my preferred way of doing it, and as far as the height goes, there was only one option for me. I asked my wife what she wanted. Now that I have my measurements and parts list, I could start breaking down the lumber to a more manageable size before milling it up. And to make sure I get consistent cuts, I like to use a stop block made by KM Tools. They're not a sponsor, I just really like the tools that they make. Then I moved on to the joiner to give me one flat edge, so that I could then run each board through the table saw to give me the height that I needed. Now you're probably asking yourself, why am I making kitchen drawers using 5/4 hard maple instead of buying 3/4 inch and just planing it down? Well, the easy answer is it's what I had in my shop, and I didn't have any other plans for this piece of maple anyway, so why not use it? Also, it's really satisfying milling lumber and then building something with it. But that does lead me to the next step, which is to resaw all of my boards in half using the bandsaw. When I do this, I like to use a feather board to help keep the material flat against the fence. And remember to adjust the guide post so it sits just a little bit above the piece that you're cutting. This will help the blade to not wander as much and give you wonky cuts. When you're using Undermount slides, the material thickness is supposed to be 1/2 inch or 5/8 thick. So I needed to run all of my material through the thickness planer until they were 1/2 inch thick. I would have preferred 5/8, but after I resawed, there just wasn't enough material left to make them that size, so this will have to do. Then, using my crosscut sled, I made my first mistake. And I know better than to do this, but I cut my pieces down to their final length, forgetting that I needed to make the cut at a 45-degree angle. Of course, I realized this only after I cut all of them. So I set my table saw to 45 degrees, and since I could not make my boards any shorter, I lined up the top corner of the board with the very edge of the blade. If I messed this up, I'd have to make new boards, which meant going to the lumber yard and spending money. Thankfully, this turned out pretty well, but the blade kept burning the end of this hard maple for some reason, which caused another issue later. After that, I needed to make a groove for the bottoms to slide into. So I set the height of the blade to 1/4 inch and the fence to 1/2 inch because you need 1/2 inch of clearance with Undermount drawer slides. You'll see why later. The table saw blade I'm using is an 1/8 inch flat bottom blade, which is perfect for this type of cut, but the plywood I'm using for the drawer bottoms is 3/16. So after I made all of my first cuts, I bumped the fence over just a little bit at a time to dial in the fit, and then ran the rest of the pieces through. Then I went ahead and sanded all the boards, and once again, I ignored my better judgment. You remember how I said when I was cutting the 45-degree corners that it caused some burning? Well, you don't want to glue boards together with burn marks because it will cause weak spots. And I was in a hurry, and you probably already guessed it. But against my better judgment, I sanded the ends and caused another issue that I'll show you in just a minute. But first, I needed to cut the plywood bottoms, so I measured the width at the bottom of the groove. Then I cut the plywood using some scrap pieces I had lying around. After that, I then lightly sanded them with some 220 grit sandpaper. Once that was done, I could test fit everything together. And once I got the thumbs up, I was good to glue them together. So I squirt some glue and spread it around on the corners. But you don't want to glue the bottom panel in place because we want to allow for wood movement. I then use some corner clamps to keep things square and some clamps to hold everything together. Since these drawers are not going to have a face frame because they sit inside of a cabinet, I wanted to have a nice looking joint. So after much deliberation, I decided to use box splines, not only because they look nice, but they are also incredibly strong. So I switched out my blade back to the 1/8 inch flat bottom blade, which, by the way, is a must for this kind of joint. The other thing that is a must is one of these box joint jigs, and I made a video showing you how to make one like this. The link's in the description. I then set the depth I wanted the spline to go, which is about 3/4 of the way through the corner, but I also needed to decide where I wanted the splines to be. On the smaller drawers, I thought it would look nice to have 2 splines equally distanced apart, so I marked the jig where I wanted my first groove to be cut. And a side note, on a new jig I like to pre-cut the groove before running my box through. You don't have to go all the way out the back, just past the halfway point is sufficient. Then I placed my box in the jig and slowly ran it through. Then flip the box and repeat until I had all 4 grooves in the corners. Once that was done, I turned the box without moving the table saw guide and made the second groove. This ensures both grooves are in the same spot. On the larger box, I used the same method, but I thought with the size of them that a 3rd groove would be nice. So I found the middle and ran it through. Next, I needed to make the splines. And since I used an 1/8 inch blade, I can use an 1/8 inch setup block to set up my table saw. And I thought walnut would be a good contrasting color with the hard maple, but tell me what you think in the comments. To do this, I used the crosscut sled. But to get consistent cuts, I also clamped a board to my fence. This also helps keep the material from shooting back at me. My first cut was a little bit looser than I wanted, so I wrapped a piece of paper around the spline and it fit perfectly. So I adjusted my fence using the paper as a shim and made another cut. You may already know this, but when you're cutting small, thin pieces on the table saw, they like to fall next to the blade down inside the machine. A great little hack is to put some masking tape down right next to the blade, and this won't be a problem. So after I adjusted the fence and made my 3rd cut, it fit perfectly. So I made a whole bunch of them, and then cut those pieces into smaller pieces. Once those were done, I put a little glue in the groove, lathered up the spline, and then pushed it into the groove. And by push, I mean tap it with a hammer to make sure it's fully seated. After those dried, I cut off the excess spline using a flush cut saw, which is very satisfying, by the way. Now I told you earlier that sanding the mating surfaces of the joints was going to bite me later. Well, here it is. It's difficult to keep the sander perfectly flat on such a small surface, and it tends to round over the edges a bit, causing this awful and unsightly corner. Now, I could have just edited this out and made it look like I did it perfectly, or told you I did it on purpose to show you how to fix it, but that's not who I am, and I want to be transparent with you. I make mistakes too, and I'm going to show you how I fixed this one. All is not lost. First, I squeeze a small amount of wood glue into the gap. Then use my thumb to press as much of the glue into the gap using a downward stroke at a slight angle. And I'll do this on both sides. And wipe off the excess glue. Then using the side of a screwdriver to gently roll over the edge at a downward angle in short passes. I will also go in an upward angle. This helps both sides to come together more equally and not just on one side. Then while the glue is still wet, Use your sander with some 120 grit sandpaper without the dust collection on, maybe a little bit of hand sanding if it needs it, and a multitude of sins will be forgiven. Next, I needed to notch out the back of the drawers for the slides to fit into. So I measured out where the notches needed to be. Then, using a square and a marking knife, I scored the material. This not only gives me a line to follow, but it also helps the pole saw teeth not to wander as I cut the sides. If you have found any of this video helpful, then consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It's free and it helps me out. Also, I read all of the comments, so leave a comment starting with the word spline so I know you made it this far. Then I used the router with a straight cut bit to remove the rest of the material, making multiple passes, taking a little bit at a time until I got to the finished depth. I am going to show you how I installed the drawer slides, but first I needed to spray some oil-based urethane to protect these drawers. Just make sure you wear an approved mask for whatever finish you're spraying. Even though I didn't show it, I did apply 3 coats and lightly sanded between each application. Then I was finally able to bring the drawers into the house to install them. Now, to install the slides, I had to keep in mind that the cabinet door recessed into the cabinet about 3/8 of an inch, which means I needed to push the drawer slides back into the cabinet by at least that much. I also had this recess on the sides that I needed to fill, so I measured how thick the spacers needed to be and the depth. Back in the shop, I cut down some cheap pine that I had in the scrap pile, since no one will see it anyway. Then ran 4 of them through the planer, leaving the other 4 the full thickness. And to attach them, I decided to use pocket hole screws, since that is what they were designed for. And other than drilling into my Craig jig because I forgot to change the depth of the stop collar, everything went well. Back in the kitchen, I set the boards in place and ran in the screws, which was not as easy as it looks, trust me. And to make sure the slides were the same distance apart, I measured the space at the front of the cabinet and then made a mark at the back of the cabinet before I installed the screws. After that, I set the rails in position, and using the supplied screws, I screwed them in, because what else would I do with them? The next step required me to set all of the drawers on the rails and push them all the way to the back, and then give them a little smack so it would leave these little marks, so I'd know where to drill the holes for these little tangs or fingers or whatever they're called. Anyways, you can use tape or a drill bit stop collar to mark the drill bit so you don't end up on the inside of the box, because that would be bad at this point. Now, on Undermount slides, you have these adjustable locking devices that are marked left and right. They make a special tool to drill out the holes, but I don't have one, so I just put tape on the end of a drill bit and hoped it worked out, which it did. You definitely want to pre-drill these so you don't split out the wood, because that would be a bummer this far into the game. After that, you can install the drawers. And if you want to make the box spline jig, hit the link in the corner to see how I made mine. Go ahead, push it. You probably don't have anything better to do, so I'll see you in the next video.